let me show you how to safely remove jammed fabric on your sewing machine. Also, at the end of the video, I'll also show you some tips that you can use if you basically want to prevent basically these jams happening on your sewing machine as well. So first, so you see, currently I have like very bad jam basically on the sewing machine. If I actually try to start it, as you see, it's completely stuck. Also, if I try to basically turn my turn wheel, I can't even do that because it's completely jammed. So first things first, obviously make sure to turn off your sewing machine so we can't start accidentally. So once it's turned off, I'm going to actually pop up basically my preset foot, and as you see, if you actually try to remove it, nothing happens, so it's completely stuck. And the last thing we want to do is actually try to force this out, because we might actually like break or bend the needle basically. So obviously we do that, want to do that. So since we are going to need to retread basically the needle, we can simply take a scissors and simply like cut off basically the thread that actually goes to the needle. So again, we can actually more safely work with the needle without causing damage on it. And next I'm simply going to take a sharp knife, so, and actually try to free up basically the needle from the thread completely. So again, we want to basically free up the needle so we can basically, okay, so you see, looks like we have the thread out of the needle. Next, so I can see I'm probably able to, okay, still not. So once we have the needle basically release it, so I'm simply going to take my knife here and basically pop it under here basically. So, and I'm simply going to cut basically the thread that's actually bunched up here. Okay, so you see it's coming out now. So we can simply find the thread where it's jammed and then simply cut it off. So once we have basically freed up our fabric, we also want to basically pull out basically the remaining pieces of the thread basically for some time, because there might be some internal jam also inside. Also open up your bobbin compartment and see if you do not have any remains of the thread that might be jammed inside. And next, basically let's retread the needle and we can start sewing again. So what can we do if your sewing machine actually keeps jamming, playing up and causing you problems? So either it works for some while and then starts to jam, or again it literally works maybe for a second and then completely jams up, or it's maybe like literally skipping stitches as well. So the most common cause of all these issues is you simply have something wrong with the tensioning. Either you basically haven't set it up properly, you aren't using the correct tensioning setting, or you are simply using the wrong tensioning for the type of fabric you're actually working with. So we are simply going to go over all the most common causes and basically problems that usually happens on sewing machines if you are experiencing this problem. By the way, the first thing you should check also if your thread is good enough quality. So if you get like a very cheap machine like this, they usually also come with very poor quality threads, and they're actually prone to like causing these jams as well. Also, even if your thread is good quality, but if it's very old, so if it's like super old thread, also again it's simply like losing its properties, and again it also will actually cause you jams. So but if your thread is like fairly fresh and good quality, so that should really be a problem. So first things first, also it's kind of important that you verify that you have actually installed and threaded up the machine properly. So we're going to go over basically most common causes basically. So the first thing is also observe basically how your spool is installed and basically from which direction this thread is feeding here. So this is on every sewing machine correct position, so it's feeding from the back essentially. But if by accident you actually install it this way, so you see it's feeding like this, again it might cause some problems with the tensioning, and again at the end might cause you jams. So again, this should be the correct position how it feeds. Again, even if you install it incorrectly, it will still feed, but again it will cause you problems. Also simply observe if it hasn't actually come out anywhere basically out of any like the place that you threaded through. So again, your machine probably will look slightly different, but again simply verify if everything is okay. For example, on this machine this part actually keeps popping out sometimes by accident, and I do not even notice it, and then it creates all these problems as well, essentially. Also, when you are feeding your thread through this like tensioning slot over here, also make sure to actually put up your presser foot. I see a lot of people actually struggle with this and can't understand why it's doing this. So essentially, before you thread it through the tensioning, make sure your foot is actually up, so it's a presser foot essentially. So if you have it down, basically the tensioning discs over here won't properly grab basically the thread, and then yeah, it simply won't be able to tension even your thread, and again it will cause this problem. So when you are threading up your machine, when you are feeding it through this slot, the tensioning slot, make sure your presser foot is actually up, so it can actually properly grab the thread. Also, make sure to verify you also have installed your bottom bobbin in the correct way as well. So the correct way should be like this essentially. So you see, it's essentially making a letter P here. If you flip it over and install it this way, obviously it will actually still like feed the thread, but again it will simply cause friction. Again, it will simply like mess up your tensioning, and again it will create these problems. So again, when you drop in your basically bobbin, so again, make sure it's feeding like this essentially. Also, when you are threading your needle, also obviously make sure you thread it from the front to the back, not the other way. So again, this way, so also from the front to the back. So I see some people actually try to thread it from the back, as it might be easier to thread if you thread it with a threader, but again, so it will completely mess up the direction. Again, it also will cause these jams. But yeah, if you have everything installed correctly, if you have threaded correctly, then the most common cause of this is you simply haven't actually matched up your tensioning disc setting with the type of fabric you're actually sewing. So essentially every type of fabric actually requires slightly different tensioning setting on your machine. For example, if I set this on number 4 on this machine, it will actually work absolutely perfect with jeans. So you see, it works absolutely great. But if I actually try to use it on the same setting with very thin fabric, so it completely messes up basically and can't do anything essentially. So again, really the best way how to figure out which setting to use on your tensioning wheel for the type of fabric you are working with is simply like getting like a scrap piece of the same fabric and simply feeding it through various times on the different settings. So at first maybe set it at 1 or 0, simply feed it through, observe how is the stitch quality, increase it maybe to the 3, again feed it through, increase again, feed it through, increase to 7 for example, again feed it through like several times, and simply observe how the stitch quality actually comes out. If you also use, for example, maybe like two different colors on your machine, for example, see I have the blue and white over here, I can also very easily check if I have some problems basically here. So as you see, I have the blue on this side, but if I flip it over, I have the white on the other side, and I simply have to look for any color bleed through. So essentially, if your stitch looks like this, so with maybe like tiny bit of other color on the very ends, that's completely acceptable really. But if you start to see maybe like a third of the other line, maybe blue basically in this case, that means again there is something wrong with your tensioning. So again, simply observe, basically run it through like several times on the different tension settings, and simply observe on each side basically how it actually like looks. So again, in the perfect case really it should be completely like white on this side and complete blue on this side, for example. But again, if you see a lot of blue, for example, on this side, so again, simply adjust this tensioning wheel here till you see only white over here, for example, and no signs of blue. Again, like tiny bit of blue at the very ends, so the other color is acceptable, but again, so it shouldn't be a lot actually. And the last thing you should also know is if you are changing your stitch pattern while you're sewing, that also will actually cause slightly different tensioning on your machine. So again, you simply have to play around with your machine, simply get like a scrap piece that you can practice with, simply choose your stitch. For example, again, so if you use this large zigzag and then switch to the completely different stitch, for example, this type of stitch, again, the machine simply will have like tiny bit different tensioning basically again, and depending on your fabric again, so it might simply create problems for you. So yeah, essentially, so put your stitch on, take a scrap piece essentially, and run it through several times on different like the tension and settings essentially, and see how it actually performs the best, and maybe literally note down basically which kind of fabrics works the best with which kind of stitch at which kind of tensioning setting on the tensioning wheel. So again, it's kind of trial and error again on most sewing machines. So there are obviously like 1,000 different sewing machine models. Again, this is slightly different obviously. So if basically I have basically this same setting working perfectly on this type of machine, on some other sewing machine it might be slightly different again. Also, again, as your sewing machine ages as well, this tensioning also basically becomes more sloppy essentially, and basically it might simply need a service as well, your sewing machine, if it has been working for some years. So again, if you see maybe for the first year it actually worked okay for example this type of fabric on the number 4, but after some years maybe if you find you need to actually increase it to the number 5 and then maybe to number 6 to actually get like good quality stitch, that simply means also your sewing machine simply needs a service. It simply has become sloppy and stuff like that. So again, it also happens with age as well, obviously. So again, these tensioning settings again are kind of dependent on each individual machine and also the condition of the machine as well. So again, it's a lot of trial and error basically to figure out, yeah, which fabric works the best on which kind of tension and which kind of stitch and stuff like that. So yeah, anyway, good luck.